Hi, everyone. Good evening. Thanks so much for joining us for the final Buffalo Broadcasters Association Educational Speaker Series. My name is Katie Morse. I'm the president of the Buffalo Broadcasters. We've really enjoyed this series so far. We have learned so much from our speakers, and tonight is going to be no exception as we welcome a Buffalo Broadcasters Association Hall of Famer who has an incredibly interesting background and so much to share. But before I introduce our hosts for the evening, who will then introduce our guest, I wanted to let you know about a couple of events that we have coming up in the next few weeks. We are bringing back one of our fundraisers in a virtual capacity, the Buffalo Broadcasters Association Meat Raffle. It is coming back April 8th, so you can buy your tickets right now. If you go to our website, we'll see scrolling at the bottom of your screen, buffalobroadcasters.com, you'll see that they're available at the link right at the top of the page of the website, and we'd appreciate your support for that event. You'll be able to watch that live on our Facebook page, and you'll likely see some special guests from the broadcasting world joining as we call out different numbers. So the meat raffle coming up April 8th, we would really appreciate your support because it's so difficult to hold these fundraisers in this time where we're kind of navigating being in person, being virtual. So it would be wonderful if you're able to support us in any capacity in that way. Now, before we begin tonight's event too, I want to also ask you to consider becoming a member of the Buffalo Broadcasters. Your support allows us to continue to hold events like these, and you can be a member by visiting our website once this event is over. And becoming a member or a student member is going to give you access to unique events, including a roundtable discussion that's part of our upcoming job fair. Something else I want to put on your calendar. That's going to be April 23rd at WNED, and we have more information on that on our website as well. So after tonight's event, please feel free to head over to our website and peruse and learn all about the things that we're doing right now. So for this evening's program, our moderator is one of our board members, reporter turned attorney, Aaron Sakin. Aaron is going to be asking questions of our guest and also monitoring your questions and comments at the same time. So I encourage you to please participate, ask as many questions as you want, and we're going to try to answer as many of them as possible. So without further delay, I'd like to turn things over to Aaron, who will then introduce our guest for the evening, Mickey Osterreicher. Hi, Aaron. Thanks so much.
Oh, you're welcome. Great to see you, Katie. Now, you mentioned reporter turned attorney, and that might be a little bit of a hint and some insight as to why I'm moderating this tonight and who our guest is. I want to talk a little bit about Mickey Osterreicher for those of you who don't know him, because he has one of the most fascinating and impressive resumes of anybody who's come through the journalism pipeline in Western New York and probably beyond that. Mickey was born in the Bronx, but he came to the Buffalo area when he was 16 years old, and he has been a proud Buffalonian ever since. He got his Bachelor's of Science in Photojournalism from UB all the way back in 1973. After that, he went to work for the Buffalo Courier Express. You young folks probably don't remember this, but this used to be a two-newspaper town, and Mickey was literally there until the day it suddenly shut down. We're going to ask him about that in a little while. After that, Mickey transitioned from being a still photographer to a videographer at WKBW Channel 7 during its glory days with Tom, Rick, and Irv in the 1980s, and was one of the best in the business. But then in the 1990s, he and a good friend of his, a reporter at Channel 7, Steve Boyd, made a decision, I think, that would change the trajectory of their careers. They decided to go to law school, and they did it while they were working in TV. And what Mickey's been able to do is take that background and all that training as a journalist and then infuse that into a career as a, not just a, but one of the preeminent media law and First Amendment attorneys, not just in New York State, but around the country. He has represented all sorts of journalists, media companies, etc., in a number of different cases and matters, some of them very high profile. He also has served, I believe, for at least the last 16 years as the General Counsel for the National Press Photographers Association, NPPA. And of course, today he continues to work on a number of matters, defending journalists, not just locally, but all over the country. And I have the distinct honor and pleasure of welcoming Mickey Osterreicher to this speaker series. Mickey, good evening, and thank you.
Good evening. Well, we should be done. That was perfect. Okay,
you can go now. We're going to get some questions coming in. I think we're probably going to have a lot of questions from our aspiring or younger journalists who are trying to get a sense of the career trajectory they're going to take. But one of the first things I wanted to ask you was, how do you get bit by the bug, right? To be in the thick of things. You've been doing it at least since you were in college. I mean, how did that happen?
Looking back, I was always the person with the camera in my hand. Like growing up, there's not a lot of pictures of me, either with my family or with my friends, because I was the one taking the pictures. I hadn't really thought about it. It was just kind of subconscious that, yeah, here's a camera. It's just, something that I've always enjoyed doing. I found that photography is a great way to be able to use your mind, but also use your hands, and do something physical. It's not just all mental. And I really have enjoyed that. I love telling stories, and I love informing people. So it really made sense. When I was growing up in the Bronx, my father was a barber, and the New York Daily News, which was New York's picture newspaper, I mean, they had probably 40 or 50 photographers on staff in their heyday, and they had a huge center picture page and a front page, and even their back page was a full picture on their sports page. And one of the photographers hung out near my father's barber shop in one of the Daily News radio cars, which had all kinds of scanners and things in it. And they basically had them stationed around New York City, almost like police. And they would respond to breaking news. And I just found that fascinating. And where I think a lot of people grew up with their parents bringing home the New York Times and reading it, I grew up looking at the Daily News and looking at the pictures and looking at Life magazine. And, when I finally got the chance to be a photographer, it was like, you really want to pay me to do this? So I really started out, my career started out at the University of Buffalo while I was going to school. I first started in broadcast at WBFO, the school radio station, but then I quickly, transitioned over to the Spectrum, which was the school paper, which still is the school paper, and eventually became the photo editor there before then freelancing for the New York Times, being a stringer for the AP, and then getting a full-time job with the Courier Express.
How were you able to land that job? Did you just knock on the door? Did you send resumes everywhere?
I didn't really send resumes everywhere. When I'd go back to New York, I'd actually hang out with some of the photographers from the Daily News and the New York Times, kind of like with very big eyes and watching all this and thinking maybe one day I'll be able to do this. But I also found that having a camera was a great entree into things. Like I remember a friend of mine was interning at the Dick Cavett show. And it was a talk show, and he interviewed lots of interesting people. And he invited me to come to the show, and I brought my camera and, just started taking pictures back in the control room, sitting in the audience. It was just really, a fascinating time. And I was always curious about how things worked and why things happened, and kind of the who, what, when, where, why, how. And it was always a challenge to tell that story in one frame when you were shooting stills. So in terms of the Courier, I met a lot of the photographers while I was a photographer for the Spectrum. But both the Buffalo News, back then it was the Buffalo Evening News, those photographers, those staff photographers, and the photographers from the Courier. And I figured, hey, what the heck? I've got a major in photojournalism. Actually, UB didn't have a photo department. I was the first graduating class of special majors. I started out in psychology and really hated that. And then wrote a special, we had the opportunity to write a special major. And so I did it really through the English department and some other departments. But yeah, I just applied, got an interview with the executive editor back then, Doug Turner. And it was very interesting because I came in and I brought my portfolio, and before it even started, it was like, I'm familiar with your work. But he said it in such a brusque way that it was like he didn't want to see anything that I had. And at least that's the way I thought. And, you know, so we talked a little bit. And you have to remember, this is, 1972. So pretty much everybody at the newspaper is old enough to be my father. And they are all very conservative. And at that point in my life, I had a red afro out to here. So I did not necessarily fit in. And I was from New York and I was Jewish. And it was like, is this ever going to work? Am I really ever going to get hired? But literally at the end of the interview, he basically looked at me and said, okay, you start in a week and get a haircut. And I kind of looked at him and I said, what do you consider a haircut? And we never actually came to terms on that. It just got to be a little smaller.
So I want to encourage everybody who's watching, who wants to envision what you looked like back then, to Google you.
Yeah, if you Google me and doing a Google, like just hit image, you'll see the picture.
That was some wild hair, but period appropriate.
And everybody knew when I was covering an event. It was not hard to spot me.
Absolutely. And we're also going to encourage people to submit questions in the comments section that we can pass along to you. As we're waiting for some of those to come in, I like to think that you experienced what I would call a media transition many years ago, different in some sense than the transitions we're seeing now to almost moving toward almost exclusively a virtual and an online world. But you were at the Courier Express, literally when they shut the presses off.
Yeah, exactly.
And what was that like?
It was very sad. I found out, I think, we all found out about 2 weeks before. I'll try and set the stage. So there were two papers in Buffalo. As I said, the Buffalo Evening News, Buffalo Courier Express, and they were both owned by families. The Butler family owned the Buffalo News, and the Connors family owned the Courier Express. And they had a gentleman's agreement pretty much for many, many years. And the news, the Courier published 7 days a week in the morning. The big paper was on Sunday. And the Buffalo News, the reason it's called the Buffalo Evening News, is published in the evening, 6 days a week. And its big paper was on Saturday. And everybody seemed to get along and be happy. Well, then along came some guy named Warren Buffett, and he bought the Buffalo News and said, hey, I'm a businessman, I'm a millionaire, and I want to make more money. So he basically decided to go head to head, publish the Buffalo News 7 days a week, big paper on Sunday, pretty much give away advertising. Shortly thereafter, the Connors family sold to Coles Media, which one of their papers was the Minneapolis Star Tribune. That was their big paper. And so there was this head-to-head competition. But, the problem is that there was really, at the end of the day, only going to be one newspaper in Buffalo, just as so many other cities. Rochester used to have two papers that were published out of the same building. They were both Gannett papers. They ran on the same presses, one published in the morning, one published in the afternoon. There's only one paper there now. Buffalo is very different than most major cities. Most people that commute to work in big cities use mass transit, and they sit there, the strap holder hangers, and they read the newspaper. They sit on the bus, they read the newspaper. Not Buffalo. Buffalo, most people drive to work. And so the Buffalo News, being the afternoon paper, like if you had a choice between, do you want the paper in the morning to sit on the porch all day and read old news by the time you came home, or do you want, the news in the evening when you had just gotten home? And so, you know, that's the unfortunate part. But I think no matter what would have happened, whichever paper there was only going to be one newspaper.
And unfortunately, so for so many of you at the Courier Express, it ended up being the paper across the street, so to speak. When that happened, when the day came where it was folding up shop, you obviously had a decision to make, which was, what am I going to do next? Talk a little bit about that and how you ended up at KBW during the glory years.
So obviously, when we realized we were going out of business, and you have to remember the Courier Express had been in business for 150 years. Mark Twain had been one of its editors, so it had a long history. I had an offer to go to the Providence Journal, which was a very well-respected paper, but I also had a one-year-old daughter and didn't necessarily want to move. And over the years, I had been friends with Irv and actually had photographed his daughter's wedding. And they were all, Irv for many years was trying to get me to come over and work at Channel 7. And I would always kind of demur because the newspapers, because of our union, paid a whole lot better than they paid photographers at the television station. But obviously, when there was no job, that wasn't paying anything. So I took him up on the offer, and that's how it came to be. You know, in terms of shooting, I talk to people about things that it's very interesting. So back then, they were just starting to shoot video. For many years, they had shot film to do news. Just like I had been shooting film all along, mostly black and white film, when I worked at the Courier, and we had to process it, make prints, and do all those things, and make halftones and scan them, and the whole process of newspaper printing. But Channel 7 had just really transitioned to 3/4 inch, and I started shooting with a TK-76, which was a very large, heavy camera. You needed to wear a battery belt, so there was an umbilical cord running up from there. Then it didn't have any controls on it. At least we didn't have an umbilical cord. It came with one, but we didn't have it. So I carried another videotape recorder, 3/4 inch videotape recorder on my left shoulder, and then you would put that into play and record. For those of you who may be old enough to remember those kind of mechanical ways, and you would just basically use the pause button to roll and stop rolling. But you had no way of really knowing. There was nothing in the viewfinder to tell you anything was going on, and that was connected by a video cord, a BNC cord, and then the microphone was plugged into the deck separately. It wasn't part of the camera. And that also had batteries in it. And if we wanted a light, there was another battery belt that went on that. But the interesting thing for me is, for all the years as a still photographer, I looked through an SLR, single lens reflex camera, and I saw things in color and visualized them as I took the picture in what they were going to look like in black and white. And just the opposite happened when I went to television, because the viewfinders back then on the TK-76s were in black and white. So I'd be looking at a black and white picture, trying to visualize what it was going to look like in color. And there was no autofocus, and there was no auto iris, and there was none of that auto stuff. So it was an interesting transition. I have to tell you that, again, we used to edit linearly. There were two machines, a playback and a record machine. And when you put in the in points and the out points, the machines would back up about 10 seconds, 7 seconds, 12 seconds. It depended on what you set the pre-roll for. And then they both start going forward in play. And at the edit point, there'd be an electronic point where the record machine would start to record. And this is the way you basically edit linearly. And it took quite a while. I'm not going to go into all the details, but the point is that there were two monitors, and you'd see the tape going back, and then you see the tape going forward. And for about 6 months after I started at Channel 7, that's the way I dreamed. All of my dreams were in two screens, and my dreams would back up, and they start to play forward.
Here's a question I'm sure you got many times over the years. Which medium did you enjoy shooting more on? Still photography or video? And the reason I asked this question, and maybe I'm putting my thumb on the scale a little bit, there's a very famous photo from a still photographer, Stan Foreman, I think his name was, from the Boston Herald. I think you know the photo I'm talking about, or one of them. It was from the 1976. There was, I don't know if you want to call it a protest or a riot over the desegregation of busing in the Boston schools. The photo is of one of the protesters taking an American flag, and I think the eagle at the tip of the flagpole, and almost spearing, hoisting it toward one of the members, I think an African American civic leader, a member of the school board. And this still image just captures the essence of like the violence, the confusion, the fear of the moment. And then I heard Stan Foreman speak one time, and then he played the film from it. I don't think it was video, it was film. And you never saw that moment. Yeah. Only a still photograph could capture it. Was that your experience?
There are lots of those. So that was actually Stan's second Pulitzer. His first Pulitzer he got, if you've ever seen the picture, is there was a terrible fire in Boston. He worked in Boston, and there was a mother and daughter, and they were on a fire escape, and the firemen were putting up an aerial ladder, and Stanley was there. He went to all these breaking news things, and he was focused on them. And unfortunately, the fire escape gave way from the heat, and he captured the two of them falling to their death. There was like maybe 30 seconds more the firemen could have gotten there. So it's those moments, when you talk about that decisive moment. The other famous, and again, Pulitzer Prize winning picture, which was taken in Vietnam. And again, there's film of it, but it's a Vietnamese policeman executing a Viet Cong, and he's shooting him in the head. And the still of it, you basically see his head snapping back. In the film, it goes by in an instant, and you really don't see that. So you're asking me which one? It's really hard to say. I love being able to, the challenge of telling a whole story in one frame. That's quite the challenge, as opposed to television, wide, medium, tight. A big challenge for me was letting things come into frame and go out of frame. Obviously, you never did that when you're shooting stills. If there was nothing in the frame, there was nothing to take a picture of, but those are ways to make transition. So being a child of television, growing up in the 50s, I was an only child, so television was like my sibling. So to me, working in television was like, I'm watching TV, but I'm in charge. I get to make the little TV show. Whereas stills, was quite the challenge. But I have to tell you, at a newspaper, there's only so much space. And either the reporters got more words or you got a bigger picture. But if you got a bigger picture, they got less words. And if they got more words, you got a smaller picture. So you're always fighting for space. And it was really an adversarial relationship between who's going to get better play. Whereas in television, I loved the collaboration. You were a team. You work with a reporter, and learning. Good reporters know to write to the video. That's one of the cardinal things. But it's then incumbent upon the photographer to make sure that he or she has the video that tells the story. And again, in the Buffalo market, it was nice because I could edit too. In some of the bigger markets, you could just shoot or you could edit, but you couldn't do both. And so being able to shoot and know you were editing and kind of know in your head the shots you needed to tell the story, you're basically doing it in your head. So I loved the collaboration. The other thing is, at the Courier, we were always kind of number two, except on Sunday. when we were at when I was at Channel 7, we owned the story. And it was really nice to work at a place where you were number one for so many years. And but in terms of the two mediums, I think it's a much greater challenge to be able to tell a story in a single frame. But between the sound and all the shots, you can certainly tell a better story, a more complete story with a beginning, a middle, and an end than you can in one frame.
You know, you mentioned the collaboration a moment ago, and we got I think, a very timely question, which is this. What was it like to see the transition from that reporter photographer team that you were just talking about to what they call the one-man band, and then they changed the name to multimedia journalist role? You know, what are your thoughts on that? And I think you and I are probably of a like-minded opinion that it has changed the industry, not always necessarily for the better.
Well, I think the first problem is the safety issue. And we just saw not that long ago somebody being a one-man band, young woman, who's shooting her own live shot. So on top of being a one-man band or one-person band and having to shoot, report, edit, do all those things and ask the questions, now you're tasked with doing a live shot and tweeting and doing social media. And, you know, there's only so much that one person can do. And, you know, fortunately, she didn't get seriously hurt. But, you know, had she had a photographer, hopefully that photographer would have noticed and pulled her out of harm's way. So, you know, the reason there's a strong saying two heads are better than one, it just doesn't come from nowhere. So I think that there's definitely, when you're working together and when you're clicking, there is nothing like it to come away from a story where you would be able to just put something together in a very short period of time that oftentimes, you know, was, whether it was breaking news or a feature or a more in-depth piece, it was really a pleasure to do that. And as I said, at the newspaper, you never had that. It was always a competition between the photographers and the reporters as to who was going to get more space. And, you know, the other thing is, quite frankly, is when I'd set up to shoot, you know, finally, when we got to the point that the cameras were good enough and you didn't have to set up lights and you didn't have to go through this whole thing, you know, I'd set up, and the person that I worked with the most is Steve Boyd, who's the person I went to law school with. And he and I worked together on so many stories, but we'd sit down and do an interview, and I just kind of put my hand on his shoulder like, okay, we're rolling. And I wouldn't say anything because there were so many times you'd interview somebody and they'd be great. And the minute they knew you turned on the camera, they couldn't put two words together. So we basically gave up on, okay, we're ready. And we would Steve would continue the little conversation that he was having before. And, you know, in a short time we go, okay, we're done. And they're like, well, when are you going to start? No, we're done. We got it. We're good. You're terrific. But oftentimes also listening, being back in the catbird seat, whereas I've got it framed. It's, you know, I hit the record button, other than making sure, you know, person didn't move out of frame or do something. I could listen to the questions. And, you know, as a reporter, a lot of times you're trying to listen to the answers, but you're also trying to think of what the next question is going to be. And I didn't have to think about, you know, necessarily all of those things. And oftentimes, for the most part, Steve would say, you know, hey, Mick, anything else? You know, did I forget something? And fortunately, a lot of times I was lucky enough to kind of ask that maybe bingo question that got lost because there was so much else going on. So there's absolutely so much to be said for working together as a team and being able to do that. And we're not seeing that anymore, unfortunately.
I want to start to transition a little bit to your legal career, but we've got a couple of questions.
Before we run out of time.
Yeah, there's a couple of questions that have come in that I think are really good and fitting that I want to have you address before we go there. Pat Feldball, who you know, long associated with the Buffalo Broadcasters Association, and I'm sure you know who you may know who Pat is.
I absolutely know him and love him because he's the one who put together my induction video, and he did an amazing job.
Incredibly talented. I think he asks a great question. He says, "You've made the most of incredible opportunities in your career." And here's the pivot. Would a photojournalist hoping to find similar opportunities be able to find them today?
It's going to be more of a challenge, but yeah, if you're driven enough and if you're good enough, there's always going to be a place for good photojournalism. You need to be able to tell stories. You probably need to be able to do more than take pictures. You need to be able to write. That's why it's called photojournalism, because it's not just being a photographer, it's being a journalist. And you're telling stories with both pictures and words. So absolutely, there's always going to be the need for that. And, when there isn't necessarily the need, like, when you worked at a station, here's your story, go. But oftentimes you would come up with a story or pitch a story. And if you're freelancing or working on your own, you can pitch stories and come up with ideas and work on them. You might have to work on them on your own without anybody guaranteeing that they're either going to use them or publish them or broadcast them or pay for them. But that's also for some people, it's very freeing in that they don't have, somebody over their head where you're like just churning out all this stuff day after day after day. So it really depends on your personality, but there's always people, to make opportunities for themselves. And that's been true throughout history for anything and everything. I just listened to the autobiography of Mel Brooks, a book on tape, where he tells the story of, and he didn't just make Young Frankenstein or Blazing Saddles or all these other things out of nowhere. I mean, it was a long, hard road, but he found opportunities. He made opportunities. A lot of it is luck, certainly, being in the right place at the right time. But, that's true when you're covering news, and it's true for pretty much everything. So don't give up hope. Just plug away. And, that's the one thing, at least for me, is I have spent my life doing things that I love to do. It's not like it was never a job for me. And I'm truly blessed for that, which is, and we'll maybe do the transition unless you've got another, because, towards the end of my career, I was thinking, all right, not a young man anymore. Wasn't old, but I wasn't young. It's like, it's like a sports guy. I didn't want to be we remember when Mickey was a great photographer, but now the focus is a little soft and I didn't want that. And so I was thinking, what else could I do that I just might enjoy as much as I have, being a journalist, a photojournalist. And that's when Steve, one day, got in the car and said, I'm thinking of going to law school. And I said, wow, I always thought about going to law school, and he was 10 years younger than me. And we said, oh, let's go. And we studied and we did, prep, and we took the bar. And it's funny, everybody asks me, well, where'd you go to law school? And they knew I was working at the same time. I went to Harvard. I commuted every day. Where do you think I went to law school? I applied to one law school. I either was getting in or I wasn't getting in. And, it turned out fine. But, for me right now, I love the fact that it's now a way to give back to this profession that I so much love. And it's so important to an informed democracy, an informed world.
Yeah, I want to get into that just a little bit, but I want to make sure we get in this question here from Tom Langmeyer. And this is a good one, and it probably speaks to your technical skills and your critical thinking. And Tom, who you may know as well, writes, how has video journalism changed over the years in terms of how stories are shot, framing, creativity, etc.?
I think the basics are the basics, you know, wide, medium, tight, beginning, middle, end. I mean, other than that, the technology, you know, when they shot newsreel and they had to, you know, shoot film, get it processed, cut it up, edit it, splice it, do all of those things, and then videotape. Great. We don't have to go in the darkroom anymore. We don't have to process film. But we edited linearly. There was no time code when we did it. These were 20-minute cassettes. It had one of those old style analog counters that you hit the button and you got 3 zeros. So you'd rewind the tape to the head, and that's how reporters knew where sound bites were, or they list them for you. And so when you had to switch tapes, you literally had to rewind the tape back to the end, hit 0, fast forward, go to that, and then find it. And you could only edit linearly. And if there was a problem, you almost had to start all over again. And now drop and drag, you know, we always had to come back to the station or meet a live truck or a satellite truck or do something. Whereas now, you know, you can pretty much work from anywhere. The equipment, you know, the camera and everything else is lighter than the batteries that we used to carry. So in some ways, you know, technology, the fact that you can shoot amazing video with an iPhone, the technology is always going to improve things. You know, I think about during the blizzard of '77, where Time magazine had to fly, the airport was closed, but the storm was over. They had to fly a plane up here to get me, to bring me to New York to process the film so they could get a picture in Time magazine of the blizzard. You know, you look at, you hear a story like that and it's like, huh? You know, because now you just live stream, you send the photo, you text it, there's so many different ways. But back to your question, it's still, the basics are still the basics. Good storytelling.
So pivoting back to your transition to lawyer, and so here you are, and sometime in, I think, around the mid or early 1990s, you're running around chasing stories by day, I think sitting in class with Steve by night. And
yeah, it was actually the other way around.
Yeah, right.
It was, we went to school during the day and we were done by 2 and we raced to the station, started to work at 2:30 and worked till 11:30.
And Lord knows when you did all the reading that goes along with being a lawyer, but the two of you managed and have done. I
got a great piece of advice. My first contracts professor said, take your books. I realize for some people, books is there were books back then. There were physical books. We read books. We were just coming, you know, online with stuff, but we started out with books. Take your books with you. You'll be amazed at how much you got read. And I did, and we did. And a lot of times, as people know, when you're doing news, a lot of the time it's spent waiting, like hurry up and wait. And while we were waiting, I would read whatever we needed to read for that next day. And it was amazing because I was 45 when I started law school. And, you know, there are a lot of young people who were just in law school, just out of college. They were out partying, enjoying life, which God bless them, they should be. But I was amazed that they didn't do the reading. And I was working and I did do the reading and I had a family. And, but it was very true. We got so much read while we were waiting. And the other, just another funny anecdote. So I used to shoot for ESPN as well. And I'd spend a lot of time sitting outside the locker room with Chris Berman, and Marv Levy came by one day, the first day I was sitting outside reading my law book. And he said, Mickey, what are you doing? I said, I'm studying, coach. And he says, yeah, I can see that. You went back to school? I said, yeah, I went to law school. And he shook his head and he walked away. And I later came to learn, you know, and this kept going on and on. You know, Mickey, still studying? Yep, coach, still studying. Marv had actually gone to Harvard Law for 2 weeks and he hated it. And then he graduated from Harvard with a master's in English. But this became a running joke when after I took the bar, we were supposed to find out, we were going to be one of the first classes to find out on the internet that you that you graduated, because you used to get a letter in the mail, whether you not graduated, whether you passed the bar or not. We knew we were going to find out online. And we also knew that the way it works in New York is that kind of all the important people, like the Attorney General of the state of New York and other people like that, the judges, they all found out what the bar results were the day before the rest of us found out. So Steve and I knew we were going to find out the day before. Well, the day before, I was at Jim Kelly's house with Chris Berman doing an interview. And we had a little break for whatever reason. I think Jim needed a glass of water or something. And my pager, for those of you who don't remember, we had pagers back then that vibrated or tweaked or twerped or whatever they did to let us know somebody wanted us. And I knew that that was my call to find out whether I passed the bar. And I, Jim, can I use your phone? I went in his kitchen, picked up the phone. You passed. And Steve, he passed, because that would have been terrible if one had and the other. And I came back. And so my memory of passing the bar exam was getting high-fived by Jim Kelly and Chris Berman. I said, your photographer is now a lawyer.
So here's the question. Did you quit WKBW the next day, or how did you end up as Mickey Osterreicher, Esquire, the media and First Amendment law lawyer?
So it was not, a direct line. So when I studied for the bar exam, I basically took all my vacation and then some extra time off, because I looked at it as I was getting one chance to take this bar exam, and I wasn't going to know any more ever again than I knew now, having crammed all that stuff in my head. And so I took the bar exam after having studied and been off. And at that point, when I came back, because even though I'd been there a while, I kind of lost my slot. So I ended up on the overnight shift. And so I worked from like 3 in the morning till noon. And I did that. And it didn't really bother me that much. I was at that point, I didn't sleep a whole lot anyway, or need a whole lot of sleep, fortunately. And so I passed the bar. I continued to work at the station. I worked at the station from 3 until noon, and then I would practice law in the afternoon. And I did that for, I passed the bar in 98, and got admitted in 99, and left the station in 2004. They were offering some buyouts. And at that point, I was getting to the point that my practice was like, I can't just practice in the afternoon anymore, and I need a little more sleep. So it just worked out. It just worked out that way. But when I started out, it was interesting because I knew all the judges and I knew all the lawyers from having covered court and things. All of the lawyers at the law firm said, come see us when you're graduated. We'd like to give you a job, and pretty much talked to all of them. And I kind of came away and said to one, like, wait a minute. So you want me to work like 70 hours a week for less than I make now in television? I didn't go to law school for that. So I basically just had a solo practice. And when you do, you just take what comes through the door. And so what came through the door for me was matrimonials, and then eventually became a law guardian, which I really enjoyed, being an attorney for children. I then ended up being the director of legal services for the Erie County Social Services Department. And so I was in charge of like 28 lawyers. But, media law had been something I always wanted to do. I was able to get on the New York State Bar Association Media Law Committee, even though I wasn't a media lawyer yet. And, I remember going to New York for the first meeting, and they're all looking at me like, who are you and what's an NPPA? But again, take those opportunities, take those challenges, and you work with what you got.
Speaking of NPPA, which is next to your name, from the introduction, the folks may remember identifying you as the General Counsel for the National Press Photographers Association. Those of us who have worked in the industry know that they, in many ways, sort of set the gold standard for quality at their seminars. attended a number of them over the years. You became its lawyer, and not just a lawyer, its lawyer, in 2006. So relatively soon after you left the business. How did that happen? And in that role for, the last 16 years, what have you done?
So what happened was, right around that time, there was we're trying to get cameras in the courtroom in New York. There had been a 10-year experiment from 87 to 97 where they allowed cameras in because they'd been banned for many, many, many years, actually, since the Lindbergh trial, which is 1935. And there was a challenge to the law banning cameras. What happened is in 97, after the OJ trial, they let that experiment sunset because they thought, what had gone on during the OJ trial was terrible and it was all the fault of the cameras. So there was a challenge to that law, and I was asked, I had been a member of NPPA since 1972, 73. I was asked, they knew I was a lawyer, if I would work on an amicus brief, a friend of the court brief, in support of cameras in the courtroom. So that was kind of my first real entree into doing something in support of NPPA. And then, as it turns out, a woman, Alicia Calzada, was a president of NPPA, and eventually, after I'd done some work and some more work, she said, and I was just doing this for them because I enjoyed doing it. Hey, would you like to represent us? We really don't have a lawyer that's dedicated to NPPA. And I said, I'd love to. And so that's where it began. The interesting thing is she obviously was a photographer. A number of years later, she said, Mickey, I'm thinking of going to law school. And I said, you absolutely should. And so she started me out as the legal career at NPPA. I encouraged her all through law school. She had a young family as well. But now she is the Deputy General Counsel of NPPA. And I am so grateful that I have someone to work with, because that whole two heads are better than one. I mean, the amount of work that we have, that two people do, that others have staffs and a whole lot more lawyers, pound for pound, dollar for dollar, we probably do more than most major, free press organizations. And I'm very proud of that work.
I want you to talk a little bit about some of the work you do in that capacity, and then also in your own capacity as a private attorney. I want to, before our time is up, I want to make sure we talk about drones because this is something that you have lectured about. This is something that you have a lot of insight about. But before we get to that, maybe talk a little bit about some of the cases that you've handled representing journalists who, maybe, for example, who are roughed up by police who can't necessarily decipher them from protesters, or can they? Right? Isn't that what's at issue in a lot of the cases you handle?
Who is a journalist is the age-old, but even it's probably the $64 million question these days. Who is a journalist? And so probably back around 2010, there'd been a lot of journalists arrested in 2008 at the Democratic and Republican national conventions. Lots of them were arrested, and then there were federal civil rights lawsuits, and it cost those cities lots of money to settle those. And so the board at NPPA said, Mickey, I know you train journalists and give them, training on what their rights are, and I still do it. But, my feeling is that I know my rights is oftentimes the last sentence that a journalist utters before hearing, turn around, put your hands behind your back, you're under arrest, if they even get that courtesy before being handcuffed and arrested. And so it was like, maybe I could do some training with police and get them to understand and appreciate and respect the oath that they swore to uphold the Constitution. When I say they, I really mean to say us, because the other hat that I wear is, since probably somewhere around 1976, I've been a uniform reserve sheriff's deputy with the Erie County Sheriff's Department. So I understand the challenges of law enforcement, which probably puts me in a very unique place. And it's why I've been able to do training around the country with journalists and police, not usually together, almost never together. As a matter of fact, the first time we're going to do it together, hopefully, is going to be in Minnesota next month. And I'll tell you that story in a second. But yeah, so it's been really important. So I did training. We did it in 2012 in Tampa and Charlotte for the DNC and RNC, again in 2016 in Cleveland and Philadelphia. And it's really been great to be able to do that. In terms of journalists that do get arrested, where I can, I will get in touch with the authorities and see if we can, have those charges dismissed. I've been pretty successful at doing that. In New York, we've had an incident or a number of incidents over the years where the NYPD has seized press credentials. I've had them returned to those officers. And as I, say in kind of that police parlance, we can do this the easy way or we can do this the hard way. And the easy way is for law enforcement to understand and respect those constitutional rights. The hard way is to get sued. And we've been involved in suits against police organizations and officers when they violate people's, and in particular journalists' constitutional rights. But as I say in my training, my goal is three-pronged. One, for journalists to be able to do their job. Two, for police officers not to get sued. And the third most important thing is for the public to be informed, because even though the First Amendment talks about free speech and freedom of the press, the whole right is for the public to be able to receive information. That's the reason that we have such protection under the First Amendment. So it's that training that I keep doing. But, after January 6th, I've had a number of journalists that have come to me, NPPA members, who either the FBI or the DOJ were seeking their images. And I basically would have conversations with them and say, look, if it's published, knock yourselves out. Here's the link. Here's the site. Here, fine, you got whatever you want. If they're not published, you're going to need a subpoena. And fortunately, up until one case, they were satisfied with that. Recently, we had another member, Amy Harris, who came to me and basically had gotten a call from the House Select Committee that's investigating. And they wanted to have conversations with her and see her images, because she had actually been covering the Proud Boys. And she had amazing access for whatever reason, even though she said, listen, I think you guys are all crazy. My politics are nothing like your politics. But if you'll let me be around as a good journalist, I'm going to cover this story. And so she got a subpoena eventually for her phone records, and we're still in the middle of fighting that. The government has now asked for a third extension in responding to the complaint that we filed to quash that subpoena. So, I mean, the other thing that I deal with all the time, and I'm trying to be mindful of the time too, because we could probably go on, not all night, but probably a few days, is copyright infringement. Because again, I can get photographers all the access, all the First Amendment rights, everything else. But if they can't earn a living doing what they do, what good is it? They're gonna go find something else to do, because you got to support your family, you got to pay for things, put your kids through school, all of those things. And unfortunately, we live in an age where everybody thinks that the internet is the public domain, as opposed to being a copyright term of art, meaning something is outside of copyright protection, and everything that's there is there for the taking. And everybody thinks that, there's no value to images. Yeah, I can use it, and who cares? And that's a real problem. And it's something that I spend a good deal of time working on. We just finally got the CASE Act enacted, and they're standing that program up in the Copyright Office, which is basically going to be a small claims copyright office, because bringing a copyright infringement suit, as you know, Aaron, can only be brought in federal court because copyright law is federal law. And it's very expensive to do that. And oftentimes when photographers only want a little bit, of licensing fee, it makes absolutely no sense to have to pay a copyright attorney a $10,000 retainer in hopes, no guarantee, in hopes of getting, a few hundred dollars for a license. So it's those kinds of issues that I deal with a lot, and drones.
And I'm going to ask you about drones in a second, but I'm wondering if you can give maybe just some very quick advice to some of our college students and people starting out who don't or maybe can't appreciate the difference between, let's say, their photos online or social media, what they can and cannot use. Is there sort of a simple way to distill some advice to them?
Yeah. The easiest way is read the terms of service, read the terms of use. Don't just click, I agree, and join, because you will find out that you're giving away all kinds of rights. I mean, I know everybody's in a hurry these days. Nobody likes to read contracts, but that's what that is. It's a legal contract. When I click, I agree, it's like signing your name, and it's signing your name to a contract. And depending on the social media platform, you may be giving away all kinds of rights and usages. And you really need to, whether you're getting an assignment, whatever you're doing in life, you need to read and understand what it is you're agreeing to, whether you're buying a car or renting a house or buying a house or anything else. And this is no different than that. Copyright is an intellectual property right, where we talk about real property rights with real estate. We talk about intellectual property rights in terms of copyright, and they're very important, because without them, people could just take and steal and use whatever they want without permission or credit or compensation. And that's what we find happens hundreds of thousands of times a day. But trying to, police all that is a huge effort.
So, Mickey, a college student comes into your law office, let's say. He's just bought a drone. And he says, Mickey, can I put this thing up in the air, fly it around, start taking pictures? Am I good to go? Or do I need to do anything?
You need to do a whole lot. It's come a long way. That whole right to record thing that I deal with and have talked to police about and journalists about. I look at drones used for news gathering in particular, but doesn't have to be for news gathering. It can be for pictures and other things, is the next natural progression of that whole right. And just like I would go into my camera bag and do I want to shoot with a wide angle or a telephoto or whatever, do I want to use a drone? Do I want that shot? And if you've been looking at all and watching any television at all these days, you will see that drone use is more and more and more prevalent. Whether they're, Richard Engel did a stand-up the other day where he was standing on the 5th floor of this bombed out building, tight shot of him, pull out, see the whole building. But we've seen the devastation and the destruction, not just from network cameras, but from Ukrainians using drones to show what has happened to their country. So, the FAA controls the airspace. Drones, even though they're little and they may seem like toys, they are considered aircraft. If you use them in any commercial way, you need to get a pilot certificate, a pilot and command remote pilot certificate. You need to take a test that the FAA gives. When I first started out, you actually had to go to a testing center, pay $150. And if you didn't pass the test, you had to pay it again. Now it's a knowledge test. You can do it online. You really need to know what you're doing. I spend, again, an inordinate amount of time working with law enforcement, because when you use your drone and you use it inappropriately, or you use it without knowing that there are any rules or what those rules are, and somebody calls the police, the first person you're going to meet is a police officer. And for the most part, they probably know as little about drones as you do. But since they have the badge and they have the gun, they're going to be able to tell you what you should and shouldn't be doing. And you're going to lose the argument just as you would lose it if you were taking pictures on the ground, even if you were 100% right. So my advice is, go online, FAA.gov, all kinds of information and advice there. And that's not even to get into the ethical use of drones, and NPPA has worked on that as well. But, we only have so much time, and I think we literally almost have a minute left. So
I know.
Where did the time go?
It's always such a shame, but we want to be mindful and respectful, and also want to let you know how grateful we are for you taking the time. And you're always very generous with your time, especially for folks who are starting out in the business. So I can't thank you enough on behalf of the Buffalo Broadcasters Association for being part of this. And thank you so much for giving us your time. And we wish you continued success, and we will continue to follow.
Sure. And I'd love to have this opportunity. Thank you for the questions. Thank you for being a friend. And for all of you students out there, listen, I'm an old guy. Eventually, I'm going to go play with my grandchildren and try and enjoy life. Not that I'm not now, but please consider joining NPPA. It's nppa.org. The student membership is extremely cheap. We don't want just members. We want people to be involved. We need that next generation because NPPA has been around since 1946, but without you, there's not going to be an NPPA. So that's my little pitch.
Well, thank you. And I'm going to pitch too before we go. I just want to remind everybody that the Buffalo Broadcasters Association is part of a wonderful program that you can catch every Saturday, 6:30 p.m. on MyTV WNYO, called Broadcasting Buffalo. We'd encourage you to watch and see what the Broadcasters Association does in conjunction with some wonderful students from Buffalo State who've got excellent teachers and professors. They're going to be the next generation of journalists, and they help put together this wonderful program. Also, final programming note, that we are hosting a job fair on April 23rd. And for more info, I would encourage you to go to our website, buffalobroadcasters.com. And just as Mickey had asked you to join the NPPA, we also ask you, if you're not a member, to join the Buffalo Broadcasters Association, because it's important for us to not just honor and recognize those in the business and those who have been in the business for a number of years, but we want those of you who are just starting out as well. So on behalf of the entire Buffalo Broadcasters Association, I want to thank you for tuning in this evening. Thank you to Mickey Osterreicher, and we'll see you at the next one of these. Have a great evening.